Hello, welcome today, and we are delighted to present on Resilient Now on how to solve today's power insecurity challenge and lead the energy transition for the Houston region. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Greg Knight. Greg Knight is the Executive Vice President of CenterPoint Energy over customer transformation and business services. He brings over 20 years of deep expertise in regulated power utilities, as well as an extensive background in the telecom sector. In his role, he is really focused on customer operations, technology, energy efficiency, economic development, and really forward-thinking new commercial operating models that are impacting the utility sector. He also, Greg Knight, served as the Chief Customer Officer for National Grid, so very familiar with also the Northeast region, as well as in Texas and across the U.S. With their gas LDCs, as well as their energy systems group, which is a microgrid business, is what we're really going to discuss here today with you all. I'm Kimberly Johnston. I do have the pleasure of working closely with Greg Knight and the CenterPoint leadership team on a key transformative initiative called Resilient Now that we'll get into. But the real purpose of our event is to really talk about the macro trends that are impacting the regulated sector, as well as how Greg and his leadership team are thinking differently and applying a very transformative approach with their largest customer, the city of Houston, and their industrials as well. So with that, I'll kick us off. And when we look to the macro trends that are impacting us, when you look at a snapshot, we're at unprecedented times. We have net zero pledges. Initially, this was going to be governments really focused on reaching carbon neutrality by 2050 under the Paris Accords Agreement. But we quickly saw during the pandemic that global Fortune 500 companies stepped up. The private sector really came to bear. We recognize that there's $7 trillion annually that is going to be invested to meet the climate ambitions right out of the gate over the next decade. We also have climate policy. So just as yourselves, NARUC and NASEO stood up this working group on microgrids, we also recognize you stood up another working group on the 21st century grid. And we recognize that IFRS and SEC are modifying their accounting standards to really provide that accountability and transparency as markets are moving to invest in ESG, creating long value creation for all stakeholders beyond profitability. And then also we recognize decarbonization, as well as power insecurity, which is really what is the catalyst at this moment in time, is we are in the wake of massive unplanned long duration outages that is prompting immediate action and collaboration across stakers at a next level, if you will. When we look to decarbonization, there are emerging technologies to change the energy mix to carbon-free, as well as electrification. And Greg will certainly speak to electrification, a big part of his ambition for preparing the grid for the Houston region, given their service territory does present huge economic vitality for the region. So we have advanced nuclear reactors coming online. We saw that there was just a couple weeks ago where that was approved on one of the initial reactors. We have hydrogen assets potentially as alternative storage for peak load demands. Solar and wind, offshore wind kind of ramping up, and then electrification of transportation that certainly will require new transmission and distribution infrastructure to handle that additional growth on the grid. Then moving to distributed energy assets, which is really the focus of this working group. when you think about kind of behind the meter, and depending on if you're in a fully regulated market or a competitive market like in ERCOT, we recognize that states are passing laws in order to make energy more competitive to ramp up these sustainable alternatives. At the same time, that is putting pressure on the traditional regulated utilities, and we recognize that electricity is essential. And electricity is it wasn't like we grew up like Greg and I and many of you here. Now kids are taught using ebooks. Everything is online these days. So when you lose power and it extended for days, it really does shut down life on so many levels. It's compounded today than it was maybe even a decade ago. So we look to see that there are the FERC issued Order 2222 to really get ahead of the curve on a customer-centric grid. We see REV in New York and then in California. But to me, this is a tops-down approach, looking at regulations and policies from a top-down approach. But then there's a bottoms-up approach, which Greg is going to get into, which is really at the service territory, where you're really looking at the commercial viability and new operating models and infrastructure to meet only make the grid resilient today, but also prepare it for electrification in the future. So that leads me to Greg. Greg, I hand it over to you to set the stage with the audience. So a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thanks, Kimberly. I'm really excited to talk to this audience about some really important work that we have going on in our Houston region. There probably hasn't been a more interesting time in our power sector. I recall coming to this industry in 2009 and from various industries and mostly telecom. And at that time, we were deploying the smart meters. And CenterPoint was a benefactor of one of the ARA grants from the Obama administration. And I will tell you, there's probably been more change and progress since the smart meter implementation in that very short time than maybe the past sort of several decades. And some of that is enabling what we're going to talk about today. I really want to start with our program that we've launched with the City of Houston. And the name of the program is Resilient Now. And I think the name really says it all. If you think about what Houston was dealing with last year, coming off of Winter Storm Uri, that was really a game changer for all of us. And we really came together with the city to think about how do we reimagine a sort of new and transformative way that the utility and the city and the elected officials in a community could partner to really deliver different outcomes for communities and for businesses in the context of increasing constraints on our grid, as well as other types of external factors related to storms and flooding and just the various number of things that we deal with. And so we have partnered with the City of Houston and have also expanded this across our region to other cities and our large vertical customers in terms of different industries such as healthcare, manufacturing, industrial sector, to sort of really bring together a common perspective in what we're calling a regional master energy plan that connects to the resilient and the sustainable plans of our communities to really articulate a thesis is what does the grid really need to do and how must it perform so that we can meet the communities and the customers' mission in the context of what's coming ahead of us. And when we think about what's coming ahead of us, we think about things like transportation electrification and the exponential growth in that space. We think about, this sort of hardening of critical assets, things like water treatment centers or, Office of Emergency Management organizations, our airports, and all these facilities that on an increasingly level need to be more resilient. And so the partnership, as you can see, is to develop a regional master energy plan. It's sort of a first of its kind framework because it's not just how you might think about typical utility planning. It's looking across a region amongst a broad set of stakeholders. And it really is articulating a set of themes and investment requirements to move an entire region forward. And it really is focused on how do we really maximize the way that we're investing in our infrastructure? How do we think about the new energy solutions that will have to integrate with the grid and complement customers and communities? And how will the plan support these communities' aspirations around equity, sustainability, and of course, economic development and economic vitality? I think most people probably know that Houston has the distinction to be the global energy capital. And when we think about being in the energy capital, we also recognize that we have to lead. Kimberly talked about a number of shifts happening in our sort of power sector industry, and our petrochem customers that fall into our industrial category are probably right at the forefront of that. We have the largest concentration of petrochem manufacturing right in our Houston electric footprint. And we have some very large companies that are making transitions to hydrogen, decarbonization, carbon capture, and all of these things. And those companies sit on a grid that is shared with a community, the greater Houston region. And so it's taking all of these inputs and is thinking about how do we need to be thinking about what is our critical infrastructure roadmap need to look like? What's really going to drive increased demand in electrification? One of the really good examples in this space is that our airport is telling us that we'll begin to adopt electric commuter aircraft, and that's going to drive significant demands on the grid. Hydrogen is going to drive significant demands on the grid. And so as we think about these sort of initiatives that are driving demands on the grid, how do we now harmonize resources across the utility with the communities, the cities, our large customers to drive a much greater outcome around resilience? And that's what the program is really intended to do. We're really excited about the program, and we'll be launching our first iteration of our findings later on this month. And so it will be publicly published, and many of you will have access to that initial perspective. What I want to do now is just turn to an organization that is a part of the CenterPoint family that is really working on many of the things that this sort of working group is focused on, which is distributed energy resources. And it certainly does have a role within our Resilient Now program within the region. We have quite a bit of distributed energy resources in our sort of CenterPoint Energy Houston Electric footprint. And we work very hard to partner with our customers and other third parties to bring the benefits of that distributed resources to ERCOT and the grid. And we're excited about those partnerships. The Energy Systems Group is one of the organizations that I lead within the CenterPoint family of companies. And as you can see here, Energy Systems Group's main focus as an energy services company is to partner with other utilities to help them move forward and achieve the objectives they have set forth for themselves. And we do projects pretty much across the country, but mostly focused on the Midwest to East. And then we have some engagements on the West Coast. What's really interesting about the Energy Systems Group's program, the things that we're doing with customers, is that we're really trying to help customers really move in advance in this pace around both resilience, reliability. But it's the other thing that we've evolved to at CenterPoint is to sort of say, resilience is really just defined through the mission of the customer. So I want to share with you an example of a resilience project that the organization is standing up at ESG. And this is a partnership with Department of Defense. ESG is one of the distinguished partners of the Department of Defense, and it has a high market penetration of DoD microgrid implementations, having deployed, backup power in these microgrids across several DoD facilities. And we're really excited about this. This specific project is being implemented at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. And in this instance, we're working with El Paso Electric. as well as New Mexico Gas, to really bring forth a program where we can stand up natural gas generation with battery backup to help the Fort Bliss island itself off from El Paso Electric's grid. Now, what's really interesting about this program is it's being paid for, excuse me, it's being paid for through Fort Bliss participating in El Paso Electric's interruptible rate program. And that's what's really interesting about the energy services contracting program, is that the organizations will go in to work with the customer, and it will identify ways that that customer can operate their usage of energy more efficiently. And in return, those savings will pay for the investments to help the specific entity be more resilient and be able to operate with a greater sense of reliability, and if necessary, operate off of the grid. And so in this case, the interruptible rate program that's being supported by El Paso Electric is used to actually help manage sort of grid security and grid reliability, whether that might be some peak shaving that they need to do on the grid or other types of things. And it also would help Fort Bliss manage loss of power from the grid. So it's serving a dual purpose. It's providing Fort Bliss that backup if necessary, if the utility isn't available, but it's also providing the utility a valuable resource on demand to help manage the integrity of their ability to deliver safe and reliable power. 17.5 megawatts of generation with 2 megawatts of battery. And I won't go into all of the details, but the system is really intended to really operate and integrate seamlessly with El Paso Electric in order to ensure that the sort of grid reliability and resilience objectives of both the utility and the customer can be met.
Excellent, Greg. This is a fantastic example of the work you're doing to secure uninterruptible power for an essential and critical government facility. So thank you for highlighting that. I think when we look to calls to action, we'd like to hear from you, Greg, when you think about the working group and the sector evolving and from a commercial operating models, forward-thinking regulations, modernized policies. What do you think is so important from your lens as a senior executive for a major IOU that's really on the front grounds and really get the brunt of all these extreme weather events and cyber threats that are hitting your grid, as well as the electrification?
Well, thank you, Kimberly, and thank you for the partnership with PA Consulting and the work we're doing with you all on the Resilient Now program, because I think it's a perfect case study around how we need to be thinking about what you have listed here first, which are public and private partnerships. It would seem very obvious that a utility would be working with their city, and they do, and we have, and we've always worked with the city. I think the question is in the context of what's coming ahead of us. We all talk about this exponential transformation of the demands on the grid or electrification and all of these other things that we have going on. The real question is, do we need to advance a different ecosystem of public and private partnerships just to match the day of the transformation and change that's happening? In my time at telecom, we were introduced to Moore's Law a long time ago, right? When we were just standing up the internet, or we were just standing up email. I actually remember those times. And at that point, we were talking about Moore's Law and this sort of exponential increase in computing power year over year. I think we're facing that in the power sector now. We're dealing with our own Moore's Law for electrification, where the impacts year to year, both driven by internal factors of customers wanting to adopt greater electrification, and EV is a perfect example of that. But then there's the external forces that we're all dealing with too, like freezing temperatures in Texas that weren't anticipated, or other types of events. And so I don't think that we'll be able to meet the needs and the demands without the public-private partnership. And one of the things that we're really excited about the Resilient Now program is it's going to identify areas where other partners can come in and participate. They may be DER providers, they may be providers of battery storage, they may be any number of providers, aggregators, and so that's going to be an exciting opportunity for us to work with them as well. All the other things here are really important. I don't really have to talk to this organization about the role of the utility. It's actually essential. But the other things really come back to the partnerships, the co-innovation with the relevant stakeholders, and this sort of bottoms-up energy planning needs to happen with all the participants at the table. So our first iteration of our master energy plan with the city that's going to come out in August will be a reflection of what their sort of demands and needs of the grid are going to be, and then how that extends out into other cities and communities. But that's going to be the perfect opportunity to now bring forth solutions to address specific use cases. And there will be partners that we need to bring to the table to help the city do things that don't really meet the mandate of CenterPoint Energy. And so I think just doing this work is also going to identify more opportunities for stakeholders and partners to work together. This whole promise to serve, which is the last point that you're making, is absolutely fundamental. We know as utilities, we have that obligation to serve. It's really unique in our ERCOT market because we're the only truly regulated utility out of our unbundled deregulated market. We have retailers, we have generators, but CenterPoint's the only entity that files that rate case and actually has franchise agreements. So we do have that unique role, and because of that, we really are sort of at the center of it. Think about CenterPoint, we sit at the center, and then we bring all of the sort of the participants together. And so we're really excited about it. And so yeah, the partnership, the collaboration is essential.
Well, thank you, Greg. Certainly, we value the opportunity in front of the NASEO working group on microgrids. The work that you're doing is instrumental, and we appreciate the opportunity to highlight what Greg and CenterPoint Energy are doing here in Houston for the region on the resilient and sustainability front. So thank you, and appreciate your time today.
Thanks.
Awesome. So I'm gonna just stop the recording.